Right, so today we are diving into a story that, really brings up more questions than it answers, which honestly are my favorite kind of deep dives. It's got all the makings of your local news shocker. An 11-year-old, a so-called kill list, an arsenal of weapons. And it's ignited a firestorm down there in Volusia County, Florida. The article we're unpacking today is from Hypefresh Inc., and it's titled, Shocking, 11-Year-Olds Arrested for Threatening School with Kill List and Weapons. So to set the scene for you listeners at home, picture this. It's September, back-to-school jitters are in the air, and suddenly this news hits about a young boy, Carlo Kingston Dorelli, arrested for allegedly making threats against not one but two schools, Creekside Middle School and Silver Sands Middle School.
And one of the things that really strikes me about this case is how it unfolded in this digital age. The arrest was actually triggered by a tip that was sent through Fortify Florida.
Right, Fortify Florida, for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, it's like a digital neighborhood watch.
Yeah.
Specifically for schools. It's become pretty crucial these days.
It really it shows how crucial these reporting systems are becoming. And, that digital vigilance is so important these days. Parents and educators need to be aware of what's happening online and where to report these potential threats. And in this case, that one single tip led investigators straight to Dorelli's home.
And that's where I feel like things take an even more unsettling turn.
Right. The article describes finding an armory inside this 11-year-old boy's home. We're talking airsoft guns, we're talking knives, even swords. Yeah, and it's important to note here that not all of these were actual lethal firearms. But you can imagine the immediate reaction, right? That perception of threat, especially when you factor in the handwritten kill list that investigators also discovered.
Yeah, I mean, the combination of those two things is about as far from a boys will be boys defense as you can get.
Precisely. And this is where the situation, I think, really kind of escalates. Volusia County Sheriff Mike Chitwood made the decision to publicly release Dorelli's name, his mugshot, and even the detention video.
Wow. Okay, so that's really where this local news story explodes into, I think, a much bigger conversation, right? It's about school safety. Yes, but it's also about how we handle these situations with minors, especially in the digital age where everything gets amplified 1,000%. So before we get into, I guess, the specifics of Chitwood's response here, is there any legal precedent for releasing this kind of information about a minor? What does Florida law actually say about these situations?
So Florida law actually takes written threats to commit mass shootings very seriously, classifying them as felonies even for minors. So this particular statute really shows how severe the state views these threats, regardless of the age of the perpetrator.
So we're talking serious legal territory here,
Okay.
even for an 11-year-old. But Chitwood's decision to go public with all of Dorelli's information, that adds a whole other layer to this, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Chitwood has been very vocal about his zero-tolerance approach when it comes to juvenile crime, and this case really thrusts that approach into the spotlight. Essentially, he's advocating for public accountability, even for minors, as a way to deter, future crime.
So name and shame, make an example out of them. That's the idea.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes. Chitwood argues that publicly shaming young offenders like this sends a powerful message, and not just to the individual who's involved, but to other kids who might consider doing similar things. It's about saying, this is not a joke, and there will be very real consequences.
Yeah, I can see how that logic, I guess, tracks, especially for people who are, very concerned about school safety these days. But, I mean, isn't there a flip side to this? What about the potential harm to the kid in all of this?
Right, and that's where this gets really, really complex. There's a whole school of thought that argues that publicly shaming minors can actually be incredibly damaging psychologically. It can lead to further isolation. It can create a stigma that follows them. And it could potentially even increase the risk of, future criminal behavior down the line.
It's like that whole cycle of negativity thing you hear about.
Exactly. And, critics of this approach also point out that it often ignores the underlying issues that might contribute to this kind of behavior in the first place. Things like mental health problems, difficult home environments, or even just the unique pressures and challenges of growing up in our digital age.
And it's not like these things happen in a vacuum. This all went down not that long after that horrific school shooting in Georgia. Did that context play a role in how this case was handled, do you think?
I think the timing is crucial here. After a tragedy like that, anxieties are already running high. Everyone is on edge. And unfortunately, that can lead to what experts call copycat behavior, an increase in threats and concerning behavior, even if those threats are intended as pranks or, kids just trying to get attention.
Which makes this whole thing even more complicated. It's like everyone involved, from the school administrators to the parents to law enforcement, they're all just trying to figure out the best way to respond under immense pressure.
Exactly. And this is where I think we have to remember that context is everything. Dorelli's actions, the kill list, the weapons, it's all incredibly concerning. But we also have to, consider the influence of this larger climate of fear and uncertainty, especially in a community that's still very much reeling from a recent tragedy.
It's a lot. So on the one hand, you have this very real fear of school violence, and on the other, you have the potential long-term consequences of, publicly shaming a child. How did the community react to Chitwood's decision? Was there like a consensus on how to handle this, or was it more divided?
It was definitely a mixed bag, which is understandable given all the complexities that we've talked about. The article mentions that some parents expressed a sense of relief. They saw the arrest as swift action that potentially prevented a tragedy, and they supported Chitwood's no-nonsense approach.
So for those parents, it was like, look, we can't afford to take chances, even if it means, being harsh.
Precisely. But then you also had other parents, and even some educators, who expressed concern about the long-term impact of Chitwood's actions. They felt that, publicly shaming Dorelli, regardless of his intent, could ultimately do more harm than good.
And I imagine those folks were also pushing for a deeper look at what causes this kind of behavior in the first place.
Exactly. They were calling for more mental health resources in schools, for better support systems for students who might be struggling, and for, I think, a more nuanced approach to addressing these situations in general, one that really considers the developmental stage of the child who's involved.
It's almost like everyone's kind of stuck in this impossible dilemma, right?
Yeah.
How do you keep schools safe without, literally criminalizing childhood? Especially when the line between a cry for help and, a genuine threat, it can be so blurry sometimes,
That is, I think, the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. But I do think that this case really highlights how much we need a multifaceted approach, one that involves law enforcement, yes, of course, but also educators, mental health professionals, and even the students themselves.
So it's about going beyond that punish and forget kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about asking the tough questions, like, what are the systemic issues that are at play here? How can we create a culture of support and early intervention? So these situations don't even get to the point where police need to be involved.
Right. It makes you wonder about the ripple effects of something like this. Even if, Dorelli never intended to hurt anyone, the fear he caused was very real. And that impacts everybody.
Absolutely. The emotional fallout from something like this is significant. It can impact the entire school community, the students, the teachers, the parents, and even people who weren't directly involved can feel those aftershocks.
Yeah, and the article really highlighted that feeling of unease, not knowing what to believe, constantly being on guard. One quote that really stuck with me was a parent who said, "We used to think these things only happened in other places, but not anymore. It's terrifying."
It is terrifying, and I think it reflects this larger cultural anxiety that we're all dealing with. The world feels increasingly unpredictable, and schools, which should be safe havens, have become another thing to worry about.
So where do we go from here? If there's no easy answer, what do we even do with all of this?
I think the first step is acknowledging just how complex this all is. It's not about picking a side. It's not zero tolerance versus kids will be kids. It's about recognizing that there's so much gray area here and that we need to be having more nuanced and informed conversations about how to navigate it all.
And conversations that go beyond just the so-called experts. Correct?
Exactly. Parents, educators, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and crucially, the students themselves, we all need to be a part of this. Because at the end of the day, it's about creating a safer and more supportive environment for everyone.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. This case, as unsettling as it is, it forces us to really look at some tough questions about school safety, about how we handle these situations, especially in the digital age, and how we support our kids in a world that can feel, pretty overwhelming at times. There aren't any easy answers. But maybe by asking the tough questions and having these conversations, we can start to create a path forward, one that prioritizes both safety and empathy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this. What resonated with you from this conversation? What questions are still swirling around in your head? Keep exploring those questions. Keep talking about these issues. And let's all work together to build a future where situations like this, while they might never be totally avoidable, become less about fear and punishment and more about understanding and support.